colleagues to thank you all for attending this lecture at the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and our new doctoral program. If you are interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak to one of our staff at the conclusion of this event. Dr. Kopelson is president of the New England chapter and on the board of trustees and book prize committee of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. He is an active Churchillian and a Holocaust educator. As a historian, he has published works on Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, Ronald Reagan's 1966 campaign and Mexican-American voters, and the 1968 Nebraska and Oregon Republican primaries, as well as Washington State Republican politics in the 1960s. The Robert F. Kennedy Memorial featured his research on Robert F. Kennedy as an inspiration to Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal. His research on Reagan and Eisenhower was featured in 2015 at the 125th commemoration of the birth of Dwight Eisenhower and at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library. When not researching and writing, Dr. Kopelson is a cancer physician. He has published over 40 medical articles, contributed chapters in medical textbooks, and lectured in the U.S. and abroad on radiation oncology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kopelson.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day to come here. I'd like to thank Liana and Stephanie for helping to organize this afternoon's event. Well, I very much view the 1980s, the age of Ronald Reagan, as a golden age for America and for the world. I set out trying to understand more about the first time he sought the presidency in the late 1960s, which is a subject never written about before. The occasional sentence, paragraph, and other historians' books mention 1968, but they dismiss it as basically a few days and irrelevant. Well, you see, though, that my talk also includes Dwight Eisenhower, and very rightfully, you're probably saying to yourself, and maybe the reason you came here, what possibly could Dwight Eisenhower have to do with Ronald Reagan? After all, doesn't Reagan get elected in 1980, but Ike spend the 60s playing golf, becoming ill, and then passing away? Well, my research at the Reagan and Eisenhower Presidential Libraries proved to me, and it will convince you today, that Ronald Reagan very much viewed the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s as America's golden age. When you're an author doing a book talk, you have to pick out what you're going to talk about in a short amount of time. I have 3 main themes in my book, and I hope you'll get it to learn more about the other themes that I'm not going to talk about this afternoon. The first is the actual nuts and bolts of that never-before-written-about first presidential campaign. Very important to history, it's the campaign that Richard Nixon, in August of '68 at the GOP convention in Miami Beach, becomes the nominee. But there were many, many delegates whose stories have never been told before, who were committed to Nixon on the first ballot, but who could not wait to vote for Ronald Reagan had Nixon been stopped in that first ballot. The critically important GOP primaries that year, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Oregon, were very critical. The people who ran those campaigns, stories never told, that I tell them in my book. The second major theme, and I'll only briefly mention, is that Ronald Reagan's main political foe in the 1960s, of all people, was Bobby Kennedy. And rightfully, you could say, what possibly could Bobby Kennedy, the senator of New York after he was Attorney General, have to do with Reagan? Well, get my book and you'll learn all about that. But we're going to talk about the other main theme, the most important to history from my work, and that is Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. My research consisted of being the first person to go through at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, the Reagan files, consisting of letters between the two, memos, telegrams, and they had 4 personal meetings that I'll get into detail about. I also interviewed those 35 Reagan 1968 campaign staff whose stories have never been told, but then it was at the Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley in California where I listened to audio tapes. Basically, Ronald Reagan, when he was a new governor, started his first presidential quest then, and what he did is every weekend that was free, when he didn't have gubernatorial duties, he left Sacramento. He crisscrossed the nation, targeting specific places to set up campaign staff, such as in Wisconsin, Nebraska, Oregon, and the nation's capital. And besides meeting people, he gave a standard speech, how he was downsizing government in Sacramento, and he wanted to find the downsizing of government and increased individual freedom from not just California, but to the nation as a whole. And those were all recorded. But it was at his press conferences that the public has never listened to before, no prior historian, is that Ronald Reagan in the 1960s is talking a lot about world affairs and how Dwight Eisenhower influenced him. And that was the key to these findings. I also was one of the first historians ever to see Eisenhower's post-presidential diary in the 1960s, and you're going to have a really special treat tonight. The voice you know so well, President Reagan in the 80s. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Well, you're going to hear him now, brand new, discussing all the hot-button topics of the 1960s, mainly Vietnam, but a lot more. Well, they began their interaction together during World War II. Dwight Eisenhower is the commander of Allied forces in London, planning D-Day, and Ronald Reagan is making films as an Army Air Corps officer, and they cut a record. They were asked to contribute their time because of U.S. war bond appeals. During the war, the public was asked to buy war bonds to support the war effort. And they cut this record called Let's All Back in the Tank. They did not meet in person, but that's their first true interaction. Well, after World War II, we skip to the early 50s, the time of the Korean War. Ronald Reagan, who's a Democrat, he's been a Democrat for a long time, he's very unhappy with Harry Truman's handling of the Korean War and the very slow buildup of troops. He's also very unhappy with the continued growth in the massive federal bureaucracy begun under FDR and continued by Harry Truman. And Reagan looks around, and who is a good person to support in 1952 for the presidency? He says it's Dwight Eisenhower, and that was a point in time when nobody knew Ike's politics. And when Eisenhower tells the public he's a Republican, instead of turning against him because Reagan is a Democrat, Reagan says, you know, if I thought he was the best man for the job when I thought Ike was a Democrat, but now as Ike's a Republican, I'm going to support him. And he became a Democrat for Ike. Well, Eisenhower, during that campaign, famously said he will reassess what's going on in Korea. I will go to Korea. And when he assumes office in 1953, indeed he did, he reassessed America's military strategy and tactics. And by threatening to use atomic weapons behind the scenes, he stopped the fighting in Korea. There were other reasons too, the death of Stalin and other things, but that was a major, major factor. The next year, Dwight Eisenhower gave an all but forgotten to history speech called Atoms for Peace. He delivered it at the UN, and in it he offered to turn over America's nuclear arsenal to an international agency. However, there was one caveat. The Soviet Union had to agree. They refused, and that was the end of that. You may also recall the terms, but they were islands, Quemoy and Matsu. Those are offshore islands of what was called Formosa then, Taiwan today. And twice during the decade of the 1950s, communist Red China shelled those islands, threatening an invasion. And President Eisenhower had the 7th Fleet there and said, well, they'll have to crawl over the 7th Fleet to do that, which they did not do. Actor Ronald Reagan, who was president of the Screen Actors Guild also, made an all but forgotten film, and go to YouTube, try to find it and watch it. It's in the early 50s, called Prisoner of War. Actor Reagan portrays an Army war captain who was sent, parachuted into North Korea because of all these rumors of terrible atrocities being committed against American POWs who North Korea had captured during the Korean War. Well, he finds it's even worse than those rumors: tortures, beatings, starvation. In the film, his character escapes, but after the film was completed, actor Reagan told the press that all the incidents were based upon actual Army testimony. By 1962, Ronald Reagan switches parties and becomes a Republican officially. This is 2 years after John F. Kennedy defeats Richard Nixon for the presidency, and it's the year when Nixon stays on in politics and is running for the governor of California, which he will lose to Pat Brown, the father of today's Jerry Brown. And also in that same year, Former President Eisenhower, now 2 years out of office, decides he wants to keep his hands in the Republican Party. He doesn't like how the GOP has been marketing itself. He feels that the Democrats have always done a much better job. And at his summer home in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, he hosts a meeting of top GOP folks to come up with a marketing plan. And what I found in the Eisenhower Library archives is that his hands-on approach has never been known before to history. Specifically, there's a script that I'll talk about in a second, but this is the record that was produced from that GOP marketing meeting. The Republican National Committee knows nothing about this. It's never been known to history. One historian analyzed the history of that time period and knew about the meeting at Eisenhower's home, but said nothing ever came of it. Well, this came of it. It was a record sent out to the public called Mr. Lincoln's Party Today. That is, what is the relevance of the party started? Not really started, but Lincoln being the first presidential candidate after Fremont in 1856. But is it relevant to the world of today, meaning the world of 1962? And there were prominent Republicans chosen to be on that recording. Former President Eisenhower, who liked to be called General Eisenhower once he left office in the upper left. His former vice president running for the governorship of California, Richard Nixon. The middle left, conservative Barry Goldwater from Arizona. In the middle right, Nelson Rockefeller, the liberal Republican governor of New York. And there, chosen to be the narrator of this brand new publicity record, is Ronald Reagan. Just became a Republican. And this clearly was fine with Eisenhower. This is the script in the basement of the archives in Abilene, and there are crossouts in pencil in Eisenhower's handwriting showing he wanted the proposed script modified. He added these words: good Republicans can and do have divergent individual beliefs. They're good Republicans who are conservative, middle of the road, or liberal. Basically, that the GOP has a wide political tent. And that having narrator, conservative Ronald Reagan, clearly was fine with Eisenhower. By the way, please remember my theme today is this brand new relationship never known before to history of Eisenhower and Reagan. Nobody knew about it. Attorney General Edwin Lee, Secretary of State George Shultz, prior historians knew nothing about it. And they record, those four Republicans record their thoughts on individual freedom, small government, and having an inclusive, wide political tent. But let's hear a tiny little clip of these two voices that you know so well.
And now we hear from one who has served his country all of his adult life, crowning that service with 2 terms as President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Reagan.
Well, flash forward, and we're going to go ahead 2 years. Barry Goldwater, the conservative from Arizona, is the Republican nominee for the presidency in the fall of 1964. This is a year after the JFK assassination. The poll numbers look great if you're Democrat Lyndon Johnson, but they look horrendous if you're Barry Goldwater. And a week before Election Day, Ronald Reagan, who at this point is still an actor, president of the Screen Actors Guild, but he also has been across the country in the 50s and early 60s because he's the host of General Electric Theater on Sunday nights and goes to many General Electric factories giving basically political talks. He's an accomplished public speaker. And the Goldwater campaign asks him to give a speech on national television. We know it as a time for choosing. If you've never heard it, please go to YouTube, watch and listen to it. It's amazing how relevant it is for today. Reaganites call it the speech because it launched his political career that night. One comment I'll bring to your attention, he said the West never really cared about the millions trapped behind the Iron Curtain. And that very night, a group of wealthy folks in Los Angeles said, you know, Goldwater's going to lose next week. We in the future, here's an articulate, warm guy, Ronald Reagan, an accomplished speaker, espousing themes of small government and individual freedom. We want him to enter politics. Maybe he'll be interested. And that very night, a group in Michigan forms the actual very first Reagan for President Club, and I go over all those details in my book. Well, one other person is watching that TV show, and that's former President Eisenhower. He immediately calls his former Attorney General and says, what a fine speech. And his former special assistant, he says, what an excellent speech, actor Ronald Reagan just delivered. Well, it was in fact a Johnson landslide, and it was not a unified party. Liberal Republicans did not embrace that wide political tent philosophy, and liberal Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller and Michigan Governor George Romney, the father of Mitt, did not endorse the party nominee Goldwater. Reagan was livid. In a later speech, he called them traitors. Well, there was an intermediary friend who got Ike and Reagan together, and that's Freeman Gosden, a name likely you don't know, but way back when, in the 50s and 60s, he was the co-creator and co-star of radio's Amos and Andy. David Eisenhower, Ike's grandson, recalled the Gosdens as amongst Ike's most treasured friends, and he became the critical intermediary. 6 months after the Johnson landslide Goldwater loss, President Eisenhower, again, he liked to be called General, gets a phone call from Gosden. He says, General, what do you think of the actor Ronald Reagan? He's thinking of entering politics. What advice can you give him? Well, the very next day, Dwight Eisenhower pens a very thoughtful, multi-page letter with specific points of advice that he wants Ronald Reagan to receive. Reagan will not only follow Ike's advice to the letter, 6 months later when he addresses California on TV and announces he is going to seek the nomination to be the GOP's governor, he actually uses some of these exact phrases. In this letter, the next day that Eisenhower wrote, he says that Reagan should make an unequivocal statement he's a Republican, that 6 months earlier he honorably supported the party, and that the GOP, in seeking common sense solutions, can accommodate men who differ sharply on detail. I highlighted for a specific reason those words common sense, because in the very next section of Ike's letter, he uses it again, that Reagan should never cease to present himself as a Republican to bring common sense solutions to government. Of course, common sense starts with Thomas Paine during the American Revolution. However, Reagan says to himself, boy, Ike used it twice. Maybe I'll make it part of my campaign theme if I enter politics, which of course, over the next few months he decides to. Well, Ronald Reagan becomes the party nominee in California for the governor, and immediately that late spring he flies east to meet personally the man who had been mentoring him behind the scenes. And if you've ever been to Gettysburg National Park to see the Civil War aspect of it, please stop at the Eisenhower section because the Eisenhower summer home is there. Very interesting in the logbook that you'll see, Mamie Eisenhower made every single guest or even family member sign in and out every single time, including her grandchildren. And there on June 15th, 1966 is the signature. It took a while for me to get the archivist together. We found it, Ronald Reagan signing in to see Dwight Eisenhower. Now, they met 4 times. And for those of you who are golfers know that when you play golf, it's not for 5 minutes. You spend many hours together in the cart, walking around, planning things, and you're going to hear specific things that they discussed. And just like those of you who are historians know John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, a torch is passed to a new generation, well, I think this photo should get equal claim because this is when the torch is passed from the man who defeated Nazi Germany, Dwight Eisenhower, the commander of the Allies and 2-term president, and still at this point the most popular man in America, with the man who he is mentoring and who would become his protege, Ronald Reagan, who defeats communism. I think this should be the true passing of the torch. Well, if you were in California in 1966, you were driving on the freeways, you would see billboards with the smiling picture of Ronald Reagan with the words common sense solutions for California behind them. And at home, you might have received this record. Reagan has a track record now. They make Let's All Back the Attack, the earlier Lincoln record. Now this is another record. Ronald Reagan and the GOP send this out to get votes, and it's, again, common sense. He gets his campaign theme from President Eisenhower. And there's a lot more. In 1952, Ike called himself the citizen soldier. Reagan in 66 calls himself the citizen politician. And as he's running for president the first time over the next 2 years, he calls himself citizen governor. Specifically behind the scenes, Ike advises Reagan on polling, emphasized Northern California during this gubernatorial run. And 2 times when Ronald Reagan is falsely accused of being anti-Semitic, Eisenhower advises him on how specifically to fight those false charges. And Reagan, the accomplished speaker, is actually advised by Eisenhower behind the scenes how to deliver speeches on television. And in a poignant letter, one of those that I evaluated in Abilene at the Eisenhower Archives, is a letter of thanks that Reagan sends to Ike. And the true origin, in my opinion, of Reagan Democrats is from the constant advice Ike gives Reagan: seek out independents, seek out Democrats. It's not 1980 out of the clear blue where he gets support from Democrats. It's right here. And specifically going after minorities, both Eisenhower and Reagan did not want to just cede minority votes to the Democrats. Here's a campaign poster from that campaign going after Hispanic votes. And Ronald Reagan in 1966 gets almost 50% of the Hispanic vote in California. And there's the article, in my opinion, the very first showing Reagan Democrats overall. Well, this theme of mentorship, which to my knowledge has never been known before, that a president who's left office is mentoring somebody else how to become a president and actually seeing him as a worthy successor, is brand new to history. And I believe it came from football in no small measure. Here's Eisenhower at West Point on the football team on the left. At a game, I believe it was in 1912, he attempts to tackle legendary Jim Thorpe twice in one game. Ike doesn't succeed, but Ike injures his knee, and he can't play football ever again. He becomes the football coach at West Point. And there's football player Ronald Reagan at Eureka College. I believe the coach-student relationship, being the older mentor, the younger learner, was very critical, as well as teamwork to achieve goals. Eisenhower famously was mentored by Fox Connor when they both served together in Panama. Even at the height of World War II, Ike still seeks the advice of his former mentor. And I believe that's what strengthened this, especially those 4 golf meetings that we'll get to. Well, Ronald Reagan, he is campaigning against Pat Brown, the man who had 4 years earlier defeated Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan wins by almost 1 million votes, and that's the telegram of congratulations sent by Ike. 2 weeks later, Reagan is still governor-elect. He hasn't assumed office. Dwight Eisenhower immediately starts looking ahead to 1968 and the presidency. And he sends this letter to Ray Bliss, the Republican chairman, offering to host a luncheon for people Eisenhower feels would be worthy people to be considered by the GOP as their presidential nominee. This is Ike's order. Nixon, who we met as former vice president. Romney, again, that's Mitt's dad, George, the governor of Michigan. Percy, a senator from Illinois. There's Ronald Reagan, smack in the middle of the list. I highlighted. Rockefeller, we met, and Hatfield, a senator from Oregon. Clearly, Dwight Eisenhower had mentored novice politician, brand new to politics, Ronald Reagan, into now a potential president of the United States. And what did Ike actually think of seeing Reagan someday succeeding him in the Oval Office? Well, in June of '66, after that first private meeting in Gettysburg, they meet the press. And there, Eisenhower certifies Reagan as presidential timbre. 9 months later, after another of their private meetings, Ike is asked by the press, General Eisenhower, what will you do at next summer's GOP convention in Miami Beach if the GOP does actually nominate Ronald Reagan? He grabs the microphone and Ike says, I will enthusiastically endorse him. And Ike is privately urging Reagan to run as California's favorite son. Well, others thought, no, maybe it's better if Reagan runs as vice president to maybe a liberal Republican like Nelson Rockefeller. Ike didn't think anything of that idea. He wanted a team, a president and vice president that have the same political philosophy. But Reagan, at many press conferences, asked, what will you do? Will you accept the role of vice president if you're asked? And if you remember from history, General William Tecumseh Sherman, when he was asked about the presidency, said, after this is 20 years after the Civil War, if nominated, I will not run. You remember that quote. Please listen to what Ronald Reagan says when he's asked that similar question in 1967.
The question of this gets down to the Sherman statement. And Wilson, I want to make the Sherman statement, but I have to remember what former President Eisenhower said to me one day, of course, about the Sherman statement. He said it's a political statement that even Sherman should have made.
The answer's funny, but the critical point is on the golf course. So they discussed vice presidency, obviously the presidency, and you'll hear a lot more. Well, that same time period, William F. Buckley, conservative columnist, he did a lot of different things, but one of the things he did is he hosted a nationally televised interview show called Firing Line. Some of you may have watched it. And he interviews Governor Reagan, running for the presidency for the first time. And in it, he starts to attack the presidential views of Dwight Eisenhower. How come Ike didn't dismantle FDR's New Deal? Or maybe only at the end of his time did he start to try to dismantle the New Deal. And I think he fully expected conservative Reagan to agree with him and start to attack Ike. Now listen to what Reagan does. He comes to the defense of the man who had been mentoring him.
Was Mr. Eisenhower's difficulty when leaving the presidency? Oh yes, I think the very fact that, and this is overlooked a great deal with him, the very fact that one of his notable achievements, he vetoed 165 spending measures in his term in office.
He goes into a lot more, but again, he comes to Ike's defense. We're now going to get into the second part of my talk, and that's world affairs. Basically, we're going to start out with Vietnam. What's going on is President Lyndon Johnson placed American boots on the ground in Vietnam. There were American advisors, of course, there under Eisenhower and Kennedy, but it was Democrat Johnson who placed boots on the ground. And he actually brought in Eisenhower as a hidden advisor, I think because, and this is work of others, in case anything went wrong, Johnson could blame Ike. Well, of course, Eisenhower had been the commander of D-Day, the world's largest military invasion ever assembled, and he urged the same for Johnson, to have a massive initial show of force. Americans don't like drawn-out wars. Don't have a slow escalation. Johnson didn't listen at all, and the quagmire of Vietnam began. But Eisenhower did have specific suggestions. Hot pursuit. If enemy aircraft or troops flee over an adjacent border, you go after them. Don't stop the bombing. And just as Eisenhower succeeded 15 years earlier in stopping the fighting in Korea by threatening behind the scenes to use atomic weapons, he wanted Johnson to threaten to use them too. He also wanted the American Navy moved north, off the coast of North Vietnam, to threaten an amphibious invasion. He wanted the North Vietnamese quaking in their beds every night, wondering what America would do next. Johnson did none of that. Reagan, the only candidate in 1968 on either side, who said, Johnson got us into the war. President Johnson, give the troops the tools to win. If you don't, then just bring them home. And he learned that all from Dwight Eisenhower. It's now December of '66. Reagan still has not even assumed the office of governor, but Ike writes him, I hope we can talk more about world affairs in the future. Over the next year, back to atomic weapons, I still repeat what Ike said some time ago. One of our great mistakes in advance was in assuring the enemy we wouldn't use them. The enemy still should be frightened that we might. The reporters of the era were horrified by this. They said, oh, warmonger, warmonger. They missed the point completely. They wanted the threat, and historian Evan Thomas has written a whole book about Eisenhower's use of threats. They wanted not to tell in advance what America would do. You think Ike, the commander of D-Day, as he's planning, sends a letter to Adolf Hitler what he is or isn't going to do? Of course not. And that's why I think had Eisenhower and Reagan been around to see one president removes plans in Iraq and Afghanistan, telling them in advance when our troops would be withdrawn, I think Reagan and Eisenhower would have been horrified. Well, it's now January 1968, and a lot of these events are having their 50th anniversary. On January 23rd, North Korea enters the Vietnam War because in international waters, our intelligence ship, the Pueblo, is hijacked by them. The crew is imprisoned and tortured in North Korea. Sound familiar from that Reagan movie? President Johnson didn't seem to make any decisions. Reagan was very angry. I'm deeply ashamed of the mishandling of the Pueblo incident. Well, if that wasn't bad enough, a week later, Americans turn on their TV and they hear something called the Tet Offensive. Those of you who may recall the term may associate it with a major American military defeat. Well, it was the exact opposite. It turns out it was a major American and South Vietnamese military triumph. But you wouldn't know that if you watched TV that night. I did. CBS's Walter Cronkite most notoriously basically cast it as a complete loss, which it wasn't at all. There was no alternative conservative media there to counterbalance what was being said on national networks, and it handed the communists a tremendous psychological victory. Ronald Reagan, the voice you know so well, he's now going to talk about the USS Pueblo, but he's going to do it within the context of the big change from Eisenhower's philosophy. We're going to rely on massive retaliation. No one can come close to us in strength. To what JFK instituted when he assumed office in 1961. He wanted smaller units, non-nuclear, as America's defense. And here was a perfect test case. What's going to happen for the USS Pueblo? Listen to Ronald Reagan's analysis. He's going to begin by complaining of the failed Bay of Pigs, but listen to his comments on the Pueblo.
We were planning a 7-year run beginning with the Bay of Pigs, including with the humiliating theft of one of our ships and the kidnapping of 83 young Americans. The official explanation given for the inability of our Air Force in the Far East to move out and support Red Wall is that all the fighters on alert in Korea are equipped only for nuclear retaliation. Hasn't that been the most persistent claim of this administration? Hasn't their claim been that we have moved at a cost of $500 billion over these last few years from a nuclear approach to one that would avoid the threat of the bomb and give us a flexible response? And now when a response is needed, we had no response at all.
I guarantee none of you have heard the voice of Ronald Reagan discussing world affairs 15 years before he was president. Well, now we're going to go over specific things. A reporter asks Reagan, what would you do? And he's going to go through a list and listen to his complaints about that escalation. He's going to say, it's a specious argument. The escalations happened. But what took 2 years under Johnson, if it had been done the way I wanted, as a sudden surge, the war might have been won by now. We would not hear the term surge again for 45 years until General Portraiture uses it in Iraq. Listen to Ronald Reagan.
Without exception, military leaders have told this great galaxy of leaders of World War II, from General Trudeau and Bradley and General Eisenhower. Without exception, have spoken of stopping the entrance of supplies and rifle. Number two, they all seem to really denial the necessity to invade, or at least to pose constantly the threat of invasion, to pin down enemy forces got to stay out of the door. Now, we have about escalation. It's a specious argument. We had escalation. I disagree with the administration is militarily. The same escalation that it took us 2 years to get. If we had it at the time the military was recommending as a sudden surge in thrust of power, it would be over.
Indeed, Ronald Reagan, so what he wanted to accomplish in Vietnam, basically what Ike did in Korea, when the presidency reassess strategy and politics and go either win or go home. And you're going to hear him discuss also how you negotiate with communists. At this time, President Johnson sends a representative to Paris for peace negotiations. That representative gets off at the airport in Paris and proudly tells the press, I've rented an apartment for a year. Reagan heard that. Reagan, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, who was a very tough negotiator with the studios, he was outraged. He said, that's not how you negotiate with communists, announce you're going to be there for a year. You give them a week, and if they're not serious, you escalate. And he's going to comment on this, but he sees it all through Eisenhower and Korea.
My statements last week about what should be done at the negotiating table were in reality points from earlier remarks by former President Eisenhower. The effect that when you sit down and negotiate with communists, we should keep in mind that the 2 years of negotiations in Korea, in which during that period of time, more than 20,000 Americans were killed, and I think you have to recall that President Eisenhower, coming in as a new president toward the end of that 2-year period, brought an end to the negotiations and a settlement of the conflict by simply releasing the word that the United States was going to review its options with regard to weapons, theaters of operation, manner of fighting, and so on.
Reagan also says to move the fleet off the coast of the North to force the enemy troops that are in the South right now to go protect their own homeland. Eisenhower and Reagan wanted fighting in North Vietnam, not just destroying the cities of the South. Well, Reagan, candidate for the presidency, begins to expand his comments via Eisenhower's mentoring beyond Vietnam to other areas of world affairs. Now he talks about Berlin. Soviet movements during the Eisenhower era were gotten rid of without even more American troops, just by Ike's resolution. In one of the toughest speeches during that first presidential campaign that Reagan gave against the Kennedy-Johnson administration, has a few parts to it. You're going to hear him actually talk about having an anti-ballistic missile shield for America. This is in 1968, and I go into a lot of detail in my book that the true origins of the missile defense shield we have today, in fact, it's in today's headlines. Poland bought $450 million worth of anti-missile defense from us today, and it's all due to Ronald Reagan. And this is the exact point where it begins. And he's also going to talk about the Soviet Union, how they constantly just break treaties. He almost calls the Soviet Union the evil empire that he will do as president. Not quite, because this is earlier in his career. And then he'll get into all America's military strength that had been squandered after Eisenhower left office.
Where did we take a different course? In recent days, there's been smiles in the Kremlin. They've been warm and friendly. But I wonder if they're smiling or if they're laughing at us. We're now ready to talk a nuclear weapon treaty that will stop us from protecting our cities, as theirs are already protected by an anti-ballistic missile program. Russian rockets are killing our young men and raining down on the innocent civilians of Saigon. But our national leaders indicate that they believe we can enter into a treaty, in spite of the fact that this other nation has already broken more than 50 treaties with this country and has indicated that it believes it is its right to break a treaty anytime it suits its national purpose. Lenin said to tie one's hands in advance and to openly tell an enemy who is presently armed that we will fight him and win is stupidity. The great society has made a big point of its supposed freshness of outlook, its zest for innovation and its gift for invention. The truth is that great society has brought forth little that is great and nothing that is new. Practically all of the truly commanding weapon systems now in American inventory were developed or brought forward during the Eisenhower year. The ballistic rockets with their numerous variations. A development driven to completion by a brilliant young missile man of a new breed, General Bernard Schreiber. Of the miniaturized thermonuclear warhead made possible by the inventive genius of Dr. Edward Teller. The supersonic jet strike force conceived and made operable by General Curtis LeMay, the father of the Strategic Air Command, and one of the greatest air geniuses of all times. The entire Polaris concept, coupling missile and weapon technology with a nuclear submarine, born of Admiral Hyman Rickover's persistence. But where are these men with their drive and determination now? Having pulled America's chestnuts out of the fire in the 50s, what do they have to say about American technology in this decade?
Well, a month before the GOP convention that Reagan will not become the nominee at, a reporter asks him, it's a little garbled, what do you think of that term common sense that Eisenhower has used? Could that be a good campaign theme? Listen to Reagan's response that a year and a half ago when he won the governorship, this was the inspiration, and that's what he used. He got it from Ike.
On this question a while ago, I like General Eisenhower when he said we were one of the party of common sense. He thinks that would be a great slogan. Well, I used it as a slogan in a campaign in California a year and a half ago, years ago, and I agree with it. Matter of fact, he was the inspiration.
It was the inspiration for it. The only time in history that Reagan acknowledges Ike is this recording. Well, as I go over in my book, President Reagan really was there all along, back in the 60s. I have an op-ed coming out in really a few days because on April 4th, 1968, that morning, later in the day, tragedy occurs. Martin Luther King is assassinated. But that morning in Sacramento, he signs his first official act pushing for freedom in Eastern Europe. He signs a proclamation calling for Croatian freedom. He then flies east and hears about Martin Luther King. Tear down the Berlin Wall. Well, he didn't get that idea out of the clear blue. in 1986, calling Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. His actual first public call was during this campaign. On May 15th, 1967, he debates Robert Kennedy on Vietnam. If you've never watched it, know nothing about it, go to YouTube and watch it. It's fascinating. At the end of that debate, the subject matter changes a little, and Reagan says, I want the Soviet Union to knock down the Berlin Wall. That's his first public push for it, not in 1986. And two other times during this first presidential campaign, he says it again. He's warned, basically discusses with Eisenhower that the best way to defeat the Soviets is to match a strong American economy and a strong American military. And of course, as president, that's what he achieves. In 1967 was the Six-Day War that Israel stuns the world and wins. And Reagan at the time says to Lyndon Johnson, don't try to remain neutral. Side with Israel, our natural ally, a democracy in the Middle East. And you don't go to the UN to seek geopolitical solutions to major crises. The UN, with all the power given to tiny little countries, is not structured right. And he learned the mishandling of the Pueblo. He learned how to deal correctly with hostage crises. I go in my book, if you remember the Achille Lauro incident, President Reagan is faced with Palestinian hijackers who hijack a cruise ship in the Mediterranean. Poor elderly New Yorker Leon Klinghoffer in a wheelchair is thrown overboard by them, and they escape in a jet. Ronald Reagan acts quickly and decisively, learning from Lyndon Johnson and the Pueblo what not to do. And he sends American interceptor jets after them. He's going to force them down to land in Italy. When the Italian premier says, I don't want them here, Reagan said, oh yes, we're going to land there, and forces them down. Unfortunately, when they're turned over to the Italian authorities, the Palestinians are let go. But Ronald Reagan learned how to deal with hostage crises from the events at this time period. We're now going to get into the last portion of my talk, which is basically from the epilogue of my book. My book ends at that Republican convention when Nixon becomes the nominee. But in my epilogue, I trace a number of things, one of which is the continuing influence of Dwight Eisenhower during Reagan's presidential years. Well, the third time Reagan seeks the presidency, the one he finally wins at, is in the late 1970s and during the 1980 election. One of the hot-button topics of that era is whether America should turn the Panama Canal back to Panama. Reagan is against it. He's asked to comment on it in a debate, and listen to his answer. This is 9 years after Ike died.
Who first was engaged in the problems in Panama? President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower told me of the idea that he had for the treaties that was far different from anything that is contained in these treaties. As a matter of fact, he was toying with a very interesting idea of forming an international corporation of shipping nations, all the nations of the world, a quasi-corporation to own both the Suez and the Panama Canal, and thus with all participating and all using those canals, there would be no possibility of one jumping the traces. He told me that in a golf cart, which was a pretty good place to hear it.
Think of all the mentoring that Ike did of Reagan in those 4 golf cart meetings. Vice presidency, presidency, Vietnam, Korea, how to defeat communism. And as obscure a topic as Panama. You know, there's probably a lot more unknown to history that they discussed, but that's where the torch is being passed, truly, to the next generation. And during that last campaign, a reporter asks candidate Reagan, Governor Reagan, former Governor Reagan, who's your favorite president? And he said, well, the obvious choices are Washington and Lincoln. But he says, you know, Mr. Reporter, people forget about Ike. He was a darn good manager. Those were the last prosperous years we've known. And remember, Mr. Reporter, Quemoy and Matsu, Ike had said they'll have to climb over the 7th Fleet. Well, the Red Chinese never did. There was no war, and to this day, Quemoy and Matsu remain free. In fact, Eisenhower clearly is Reagan's hero. Michael Deaver, one of his assistants, remembered that there was a photo of Reagan and Ike in every office that the two shared. Peter Robinson, the second name down there, is the actual Reagan speechwriter who wrote, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He and I were chatting about my brand new findings on Eisenhower being the mentor of Reagan, which he knew nothing about also. And he says, you know, Gene, that explains something. I've been many times over the years at the Reagan home in Pacific Palisades, and on their family piano, every single photo is of the family, with one exception. There's a photo of Ike. I never knew why, now I do. And in Reagan's Oval Office desk is a photo of Ike In the private study that Reagan had, there was a bust, and in the cabinet room is a towering portrait of General Eisenhower. Well, as you recall, likely Eisenhower leaves office and he gives his farewell address, the military-industrial complex speech. You know it from that, but one of the things he says is peace through strength. The vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. President Reagan loved that quote. He cited it very, very frequently as president. And as you see, as people in history know, he gave his speeches via index cards. He never used a teleprompter. Other historians before me said Ronald Reagan as president's role model was Franklin Roosevelt. I didn't find that at all in my history. So what I did is the search engine at the Reagan Library keeps track of every single public utterance or written comment that the president made, be it press conference, proclamation, anything he officially did. And I searched how many times during those 8 years did President Reagan cite a predecessor president. Well, a hero to Reagan was Lincoln, but he cited him about 100 times. Teddy Roosevelt was a hero. He has a bust of Roosevelt in his office too, but he only cited him 25 times in 8 years. FDR, who these other historians claim was a role model, I don't have his number there, but it's only 56 times. The prior president who President Reagan cites the most publicly is Dwight David Eisenhower. Well, now we're going to go to December 8th, 1983. To the day, this is the 30th anniversary of Ike's Atoms for Peace speech. Right now, President Reagan is negotiating nuclear arms reductions. Remember, that's what Ike had tried to achieve with that 1953 speech. This is before Gorbachev. It's with Andropov, the Soviet leader. Andropov cancels the meeting. He leaves. Reagan meets the press. He's dejected, and the press discusses with Reagan this 30th anniversary. Reagan says, "My administration endorses Ike's view completely. This is what we're dedicated to doing." President Reagan thus made achieving President Eisenhower's unfulfilled goals of getting rid of nuclear weapons his own official policy. 6 months later, it's the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Ronald Reagan is the first American president to fly to Normandy to commemorate that. And of course, whose troops is he honoring? Ike's. He says, "I will forever stand for Ike's D-Day veterans. They're my heroes like they were his." Well, as he's speaking, aircraft fly over him. They are aircraft from what is offshore, just off the coast of Normandy, is the American aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. Reagan then goes into Marine One and flies over the aircraft carrier saying, "The heroic operation planned and commanded by Ike, D-Day, still inspires heroic efforts." And in fact, the crew on the aircraft carrier goes into formation, spelling out I-K-E. Reagan grabs the mic, which is of course broadcast below. "I like Ike, I love Ike." During the Reagan administration are many anniversaries and commemorations at the 25 and 30-year point of programs begun by Dwight Eisenhower. One of the most important in history is a secret program after the U-2 spy plane incident where secret satellites were launched by America to photograph the Soviet Union and other enemies. It was called the Corona Project, and it had its 25th anniversary while Reagan was president, and he goes to the CIA and says, "I reaffirm Ike's conclusion that Americans don't have to live in fear about what our enemies are doing because we have overhead reconnaissance. We know what's going on." Well, now it's Ronald Reagan's turn to leave the White House in January of 1989. Listen to a little snippet of his farewell address. He's going to talk about the Reagan Revolution, which he appreciates the term, but he went into politics. He's rediscovering the Eisenhower years. You'll hear him use the term citizen politician, common sense, that he goes into politics in the 60s to bring small government to people, and he honors still Ike's troops at D-Day and in Korea.
They called it the Reagan Revolution. You accept that. But for me, it always seemed more like the great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense. Common sense told us that when we put a big tax on something, the people will produce less of it. So we cut the people's tax rates, and the people produce more than ever before. Common sense also told us that to preserve the peace, we have to become strong again after years of weakness and confusion. So we rebuild our defenses, Not only have the superpowers actually begun to reduce their stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and hopefully even more progress is right. I never meant to read in politics. It wasn't my intention when I was young. But I was raised to believe we had to pay the way for the blessings bestowed on us. But back in the 1960s, when I began, it seemed to me that we began reversing the order. That through more and more rules and regulations and confiscatory taxes, the government was taking more of our money, more of our options, and more of our freedom. I went into politics in part to put up my hand and say, stop. I was a citizen politician, and it seemed the right thing for a citizen to do. When the father down the street, we fought in Korea, for the family who lost son Nancy. So we've got to teach history.
We've got to teach history. It's an important quote that very few people realize Reagan made in that farewell address. And here is that official cabinet portraiture. President Reagan, Vice President Bush, the whole cabinet, and they're looking down, I'm sure with pride, on the man he mentored from a novice politician now into a hugely successful President of the United States who brings back a roaring economy and defeats communism without firing a single shot, is his mentor, General Dwight Eisenhower. Thank you.